Okay, welcome back to 121 Community Church members and to our study of the Gospel of John. And welcome back to the new year. It's January 2 of 2016, and we're going to continue with our look at the Gospel of John, and especially under the theme of the new Exodus. And it is in this lesson that we will reach the conclusion of chapter 5. We will reach 5:47, and at the conclusion of chapter 5 we actually will have our consolidated list of the 10 signs of the Messianic hour, and so it will be a good time to do a little wrap-up summary. And so we're going to take a look at the triad on the left. We'll begin by looking at verses 30 through 35. And we're going to take a look at the three signs of testimony. We've just finished looking at the signs of the teaching to the Sanhedrin. Now we're going to look at the three signs of testimony. And these also are addressed directly to the Sanhedrin. And we notice that for theological insight, the allos other witness of verse 32 is referencing the Father, who has provided testimony for Jesus as the Son and as the Messiah in three ways: by providing a forerunner in John the Baptist, and through the manifestation of the Father's works, and through the Old Testament prophetic scriptures. Now in note 2 we notice that Jesus' Krisis judgment is a just judgment because he shares the will of the Father who sent him. And zeteo means to desire, to bring something into relation, and that bringing into relation is the thelema, will of the Father, which is always the kaios, upright and just and righteous. So Jesus is united with the Father in always desiring the Father's righteous will, even when it comes to judging the false Judaism of the Sanhedrin. And we notice in note 3 that the another, which is referencing the Father, bears witness to Jesus' messianic identity. And the Greek used is allos martyreo. Another confirms my identity, and that confirmation is always aletheis martyria. It is always a testimony which is divinely true. It is a testimony from the Father, which is always aletheis from aletheia, the divine truth, as a testimony. Now in note 4, the first of the testimonies given by the Father was given through John the Baptist, who was the forerunner, and we have described here he was the lamp of the truth. He was the luknos, or the light of a lamp, and it kept burning, which continually burned for a specified period of time. He was the spiritual Elijah, John the Baptist. He pointed the way as a voice in the wilderness. And we also see in Revelation 21:23 that, and that was written just prior to the Gospel, that Jesus is described as the lamp of the new city of God. And, of course, Revelation was written on the Isle of Patmos just prior to the writing of the Gospel of John back in Ephesus. And so, at the conclusion of Block 1, we have Note 5, the 8th sign of the Messianic hour is that of the sign of the forerunner of John the Baptist. The 8th sign of the Messianic hour is that of the sign of the forerunner. And that takes us on to Block 2, verses 36 through 38, which is going to be the sign of the Father's works. And our theological insight here, first of all, the Greek concept erga always refers to deeds, actual deeds in the Scriptures. They are what the Word of Christ affected as word events. So it's the erga word events affected by the word of Christ. And then 2, which is very important to understand here, the evidence beyond the sensate. Jesus points out to the Sanhedrin that it is not by sensate, sight and sound, that the Father gives his testimony, and that was certainly true with regard to the baptism by John the Baptist. The seeing of the Spirit descending and the hearing of the voice of the Father were certainly not sensate sight and sensate sound. They were spiritual and they were transcendent. Now note too, the next testimony which is given by the Father is through the divine works that are to be completed by Jesus the Messiah. They are the ergon didymi, the works given by the Father, and the concept used for completing is to complete the teleology of salvation, the teleosis. Jesus comes to complete the teleology of the plan of salvation, which has been impregnated into all creation from the very beginning. Christ comes to complete that teleosis of salvation. And then in note 3, they have not seen the Father's form. And this is a very important statement by John the Apostle here. We need to pay special attention to note 3 in block 2. This is key information from John the Apostle. John the Apostle takes up that concept of eidos again, and he says that Jesus Christ is the eidos form of the true with regard to God himself. That's a huge, powerful statement, especially to a Greek community in Ephesus. This is huge. Jesus Christ is the eidos form of the true with regard to God himself. And the Sanhedrin have not horao spiritually seen or spiritually discerned this foundational truth. The foundational truth that Jesus Christ is the eidos form of the true with regard to God the Father. When you see Jesus Christ, you see the Father. He is in the Father is in him. He is the eidos form of the true with regard to God the Father. That is a powerful, in fact, that's the most powerful thing that can be said, in addition to saying that Jesus Christ is the incarnate Logos. It's hugely significant for the Greek citizenship at Ephesus, especially. Powerful statement by John the Apostle. So they have not spiritually discerned this foundational truth. And also we know that in note 4, the reason for this is certainly because the Logos does not dwell in them. And the Greek concept meno is used here, which means the divine Logos does not internally indwell or endure within them as a personal communion. If we are spiritual beings who have surrendered to God, then we are in a spiritual dialogue with God. In our faith, we are in a faith dialogue, a faith dialectic with the Father. In the case of Judaism, or in the case of the Christian, we are in a spiritual dialogue continually with our covenant relationship in the new covenant. And this is something that was lacking. John the Apostle said Jesus said this was lacking in the Sanhedrin. They didn't have this communal spiritual dialogue with the eternal Logos. That was missing in their life, and that's why they could not discern the spiritual truth that Jesus Christ is the eidos form of the true with regard to God himself. So at the conclusion of block 2, the 9th sign of the Messianic hour is that of the sign of the Father's works. The 9th sign of the Messianic hour is that of the sign of the Father's works. And that takes us on to block 3, the sign of prophetic scripture. We've had the sign of the forerunner, the sign of the Father's works, which are the word event deeds, and now we're going to take a look at the sign of prophetic scripture. And our theological insight here is taken out of the Expositor's Greek Testament, and it points to Moses. In the types of the deliverance from Egypt, in the symbolic institutions of the law, and the promise of a prophet like himself, it was of Jesus that Moses wrote. It was of Jesus that Moses wrote. So we see that searching the scriptures bears witness to Jesus' messianic identity, and the term used is a euraunao, to search out or to investigate something. The graphe, divine scriptures, and they will, martyreo, again shows up, they will bear witness to Christ as the Messiah. Now the Sanhedrin, their lack of spiritual perception is due to the fact that they do not have the love of God in their heart, the agape love of God, a love exemplified by the love of the Son for the Father. And Jesus tells them it will actually be Moses who will prosecute you in the final judgment. He tells the Sanhedrin, Moses and the words of Moses, the epistles of Moses, are going to prosecute you in the final judgment. And this is a key here because he's speaking to the gramma, or the epistles that Moses wrote, because Jesus says they pointed to the eschatological universal exodus that will come when the Messiah arrives, and they were pointing toward himself, toward Jesus as the Messiah. But they did not discern this because they did not have the love of God in their heart, and they did not have the dialogue of the Logos in a spiritual communion with the Father. And so we have the 10th sign of the Messianic hour as that of the sign of the prophetic scriptures. So we're given in verses 30 through 47 the final 3 signs of the Messianic hour, which gives us a conclusive total of 10 signs of the Messianic hour. And we're going to take a look at that and review that on the right half of the page. If you notice that in this theme of a new Exodus for the Gospel of John, instead of the 10 Commandments, after completing chapter 5, we have the 10 signs of the Messianic hour. And let's just go through them. We have the sign of omniscience with the woman at Jacob's well, the Samaritan woman, the sign of omnipotence, healing of the nobleman's son, the sign of lordship, the healing on the Sabbath at the pool of Bethesda, the sign of divine equality, the teaching sign of the Sanhedrin, the sign of divine judgment, which was a teaching sign to the Sanhedrin, and the sign of divine honor, which was a teaching sign to the Sanhedrin, and then the 3 we've just covered, sign of the Messianic hour proper, which was a teaching sign, and then the 3 we've just covered, the sign of the forerunner as the spiritual Elijah, the sign of the Father's works, and the sign of the prophecy of Scripture, all given as testimony to the Sanhedrin. This gives us a tremendous lesson, a great teaching, and a great synopsis after reaching to the conclusion of chapter 5, and especially since John the Apostle so appropriately closes out in 39 through 47 with a discussion of Moses. He really keys in and concentrates on Moses and concentrates on the Exodus, and really brings home the fact of this eschatological universal Exodus that is inaugurated by Jesus and the disciples, and that this eschatological universal Exodus has been an exodus that took place after the cleansing of the temple and that initial confrontation with the Sanhedrin, and it has continued and continued until it came to a very critical point of the actual healing on the Sabbath, which created a crisis moment of catastrophic judgment against the Sanhedrin, because the Sanhedrin were determined to execute Jesus. And so we have this tremendous confrontation because of the healing on the Sabbath. We have the teachings that the Father and the Son never cease from working toward the plan of salvation. There is no rest from working toward the plan of salvation. And we have the teachings, but then we have the 3 testimonies. And the testimonies are very obviously the forerunner of John the Baptist, and then those divine works that are given to Jesus to complete concerning the teleology of the plan of salvation, which have been fulfilled as a teleology of the plan of salvation. And all this points, as far as the Apostle John is concerned, all of this points to the universal new Exodus prophesied by Moses. Moses prophesied of a Messiah not unlike himself, a Messiah who would come and lead a new Exodus out of what kind of oppression? The oppression of false Judaism that has been so horrendous that it threatens by death the believers. The believers were believers out of fear of the horribly deteriorated office of the Sanhedrin. It had evolved into a regime of power, political power, and oppression. And Jesus came to lead a new universal exodus out of this oppression of false Judaism, and he authenticated it, and he made it manifestly clear through the unveiling of 10 significant signs, 10 significant semions, signs of the Messianic hour. The hour is now, says Jesus over and over again. The hour is coming, and the hour has now arrived. The hour has now arrived. And he unveils it as omniscience, omnipotence, lordship, equality, judgment, honor, the Messianic hour itself, through the spiritual Elijah, the Father's works, and the prophecy of Scripture. Tremendous lesson, tremendous synopsis of where we've reached after concluding 5 chapters of study in the Gospel of John, which was written immediately after the epistle of the Revelation, the book of Revelation. After John returned from the Isle of Patmos, he returned to Ephesus, and the bishops petitioned him to write his gospel. This gospel comes after the Revelation, and this gospel speaks of an exodus that is extremely important for false Judaism and all false teaching that is certainly prevalent in Ephesus at the time. You've got the Judaizers present there. You've got the proto-Gnosticism that's on the uprise that will flourish on into the 2nd century. And you've got a tremendous need for a liberation and for the churches in Asia Minor to stand firm in this liberation, stand firm in the new Exodus that is being led by one not unlike Moses himself, the Messiah, Jesus, who comes to inaugurate and to fulfill the works of the Father. And that'll wrap up our 11th lesson up through John 5:47.